So what I'd like to do is introduce to you, before he comes up and speaks, is Dr. David Pyrus. Dr. Pyrus is actually at the University of Colorado Boulder. We were very fortunate to hear that he's actually part of a panel that's going to occur tomorrow about gangs. And so we begged, prodded, asked the Criminal Justice Department, as well as Mr. Pyrus, if he showed up a day early. Because we saw the topic and we just thought it would be a great interest to this group. And he agreed on that. So what I've learned from his work is that he's really has specialized in gangs in terms of how they work, confronting them, approaches, understanding how they look at things, working with other agencies. And so in fact, there's actually a book that's coming out that he's authored that talks about gangs. But he's also partnered with someone that's previously conducted a symposium here as well. It's Dr. Decker from Arizona State, who has been widely known, widely respected for his work in gangs as well. And Dr. Pyrus is, I don't want to say following his footsteps, because he's expanding on those footsteps, but he was able to grab on that knowledge that Dr. Decker has and really expanded it, and he's continued to do that. And so we're very fortunate to have him here. I'm sure Colorado, sir, is much cooler right now than us, although our temperatures aren't too bad. It snowed the other day, yeah. We don't get that very often here. So, and with that, I'll ask Dr. Pyrus to come on.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Manjarres, and thank you to Dr. Alarid and Dr. Cano for inviting me here today. It's really a pleasure to be here today. I'm absolutely thrilled to see this is a beautiful campus. I didn't realize that. The only time I've been to El Paso before was when I was driving from Arizona to move to just outside of Houston when I was a faculty member over at Sam Houston State University. And it was during the nighttime, and it was on 4th of July. So the most exciting part about El Paso to me was seeing the fireworks on the 4th of July. But this is upping the stakes here, clearly. So thank you for those of you who were able to make it here today. I know you've driven far, some of you maybe not so far, but I'm excited to be here today to be able to share with you some findings that I hope will be useful to you, both to understand prison gangs and then to be able to respond to them. This project has consumed the last 5 years of my life. I've had 2 kids during that time, 1 move, only 1 marriage, just 1 marriage, and I probably lost at least an inch of hairline related to this project. So I'm excited to be able to share this with you today because this work has culminated in this forthcoming book, and that we call Competing for Control, Gangs in the Social Order of Prisons, which tackles a wide range of issues. What you're going to see here today is sort of the highlight reel. I'm going to go into some detail, but not as much as you'd see in the book, about all these key findings that have emerged from this project. I need to recognize my colleague, Scott Decker. This project wouldn't have been possible without him. He's a co-author on the book. He was also an investigator on this research. And with your packet, there's a promotional flyer. The book's not coming out for a couple more months, but it should be out in August or September. I'm going to focus on 2 sections in this presentation. One of the sections is going to be about understanding prison gangs. I'm going to talk maybe 5 to 10 minutes about the bigger problems associated with these groups. I don't think I need to go into a lot of detail on the problems of prison gangs, but what I want to do is to just take stock of what we do know, at least prior to this project. I'll spend a few minutes telling you about the Lonestar project, what we did, how we got access into the prison system, the kinds of questions that we asked. And then go into detail about the characteristics of the people who get involved in these gangs, and then how they're organized and structured, and then the power and control that they exert behind bars and then on the street. And that'll transition into a Q&A section. And then next we'll go into how we respond to gangs. So how people join them, why they join them in prison, and then how they leave them in prison. The impacts of this gang membership in prison on the street. So focusing on recidivism, both staying in gangs, taking their gang membership from prison to the street, and then moving into a discussion about the gang renouncement and disassociation program, which the Texas Department of Criminal Justice has had in place for almost 20 years. And so we provide some preliminary findings of an evaluation of that. And then go into some details about the programs and policy implications. I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so that if you do have questions, I would love to be able to field them and to be able to answer them to the best that I can in relation to the data that we've collected. I don't want to go beyond our data. I want to be able to stick to what we've collected, because like a lot of academics, they go beyond their data with their implications for policy and practice. So with that being said, let's talk about the problems of prison gangs. And prison gangs, oftentimes the headlines don't make it out, or things that should make the headlines don't make it outside of the prisons. Back in 2013, there were two really significant events that occurred. This one was in California. This had long been, this issue had been developing over a long period of time, but this is related to the hunger strikes in the California prison system. And if you're not aware of it, this was led by 4 members of prison gangs. White, black, Latino gang members came together to organize these hunger strikes in the prison system. From Pelican Bay, the Supermax prison, they got 30,000 inmates to engage in the hunger strikes. Some of them for a period of 2 months. What they were protesting was the conditions of solitary confinement. The Supermax being placed in solitary confinement for extended periods of time, or indeterminate periods of time. Some of them were in there for well over a decade, some of them for 2 decades. But what's fascinating about this, for one, is that it made international headlines, and for 2, that you could get a small group of inmates who are in lockdown conditions to be able to get a much larger group of inmates who are not in gangs to engage in hunger strikes, to withdraw from eating food. This was led by a purported member of the Aryan Brotherhood, Todd Ashker, and it resulted in a class action lawsuit against the state of California, which was ultimately settled. And California reformed their solitary confinement practices. No longer would they place gang members in solitary confinement based on their status as a gang member. It had to be based on their behaviors. So that was one really remarkable incident that occurred in 2013. Shortly thereafter, this is something that hits close to home in Colorado and to some extent in Texas as well. This was when Evan Ebel, who was affiliated with the 211 prison gang, 211 Crew prison gang. And Evan Ebel was released from the Colorado Department of Corrections. And 7 weeks later, and this is a man who spent upwards of 6 years in solitary confinement, 7 weeks later, he cut off his ankle monitor. He killed a pizza delivery driver for his uniform. He got his girlfriend to buy him a gun. And he drove to the house of Tom Clemens' house, who was the executive director of the prison system for the entire prison system in Colorado, knocked on his door and shot and killed him on his front porch. This was back in 2013. This looms large still in Colorado. And the rest of the country, we just haven't seen violence like this occur at such a high level that's related to gangs. There's different narratives. One is that this is a gang hit. The other narrative is that this is someone who was extremely mentally unstable and he had access to the DOC director. The last one is closer to home as well. And this is more recent, and this was relevant to us because this occurred while we were collecting data for the Lonestar project. Back in 2013, there was a multi-jurisdictional task force that led to the indictments of 75 members of the Aryan Brotherhood, some of whom were implicated in the blowtorch removal of a gang tattoo. And that was the inspiration for this Sons of Anarchy episode. So we often think about prisons as the problems being confined behind the walls, but that's not necessarily the case. The problems extend outside of the prison system. They aren't confined to those walls. They move from the outside to the inside and from the inside to the outside. These are anecdotes that I'm describing. The previous 3 slides were all anecdotes, and I would suspect that members of this room could have some anecdotes that are probably just as sensational as what I've just described. But let's talk a little bit about some of the research in the United States. So when did these gangs start to emerge in the prison system? This gives you a representation of when we saw these gang problems. So in the 1950s or earlier, all we saw were gangs that existed in California and Washington prison systems. By the 1960s, we saw a cluster of emergence in the Midwest with Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, as well as Rhode Island. By the 1970s, we saw the boom start to initiate. We saw the first trappings of gangs in the Texas prison system, and then we saw it in 9 other states as well. But it went into full force by the 1980s. By that period of time, the majority of state prison systems and the BOP had gangs that existed in their prison systems. And then thereafter, we also saw some rises. So we also know that around the 1970s was the build-up to the prison boom in the country. And by the 1980s, we saw the growth of prisons and the growth of street gangs throughout the United States. This was no longer a Los Angeles or Chicago issue. These gangs were starting to become issues everywhere. And so we saw the rise of street gangs, we saw the rise of prison gangs occurring right around the same time to one another. How many gang members are there in prison systems across the country? What proportion of inmates are involved in gangs? In general population surveys, so if we look at representative surveys of people in the United States, the 320 million people in the United States, about 1/4% of people are at least identified by law enforcement of being involved in gangs. When we look at just at juveniles, at any given time, about 2% of juveniles are involved in gangs. Now this is age graded. There are higher rates among 15-year-olds and 16-year-olds than there are among 12-year-olds and 11-year-olds. But in prison systems, whether it's juvenile facilities, whether it's state facilities, or whether it's county jails, gang members are far overrepresented by a factor of like 25 to 50 when you compare it to the general population. This is surveys of law enforcement or departments of corrections that give us a sense of the proportion of inmates who are involved in gangs. So we have the classic work by the camps, which was the first study. It was the monumental study that identified what proportion of inmates were involved in gangs. It was a smaller study, but they pegged it at 3% of the inmates. More recent work, we start to see some more stability in these estimates. And the work that I did more recently, it was a survey of prison systems throughout the US. We found that about 15% of inmates, if you aggregate it up across the 51 prison systems, were involved in gangs. They were either confirmed members or they were associated members. That translates into about 213,000 prison gang members across the United States. And remember, we've got 1.6 million people in our prisons. So it's a healthy proportion that are involved in gangs. And it's been pretty stable over a long period of time. And the thing to remember, and that's most relevant to this audience, is that they all come home. At least most of them come home. About 95% of them come home. And prisons turn over, the prison populations turn over at about a 40% rate. That's equivalent to our hospitality industries, our service industries. Again, people are coming in and they're coming out. There's a lot of churning, which means that what happens on the inside matters for what happens on the outside. So here are what we would call some inconclusive facts about prison gangs. And maybe facts isn't the right word, but there is some good research that would lead to these conclusions so far. The other questions, when did gangs emerge? How many of them are there in prison? Those are easier questions to answer because departments of corrections, they have classification procedures to identify them. Law enforcement agencies have clear classification procedures that are typically used pretty systematically. These issues about misconduct, the orchestration of riots and uprisings, the control of contraband, these are a little bit harder to document, at least systematically. But there is good reason to believe that gang membership exacerbates risk of misconduct while behind bars, particularly violence. That it's not just a reflection of individuals because they are at high risk for committing crime. It's the groups that are influencing their behavior. There's good evidence to show, whether it was from California, the recent riots in South Carolina, the riots in Ohio, and so on, that gangs are implicated in some of these riots, and then the uprisings in these prisons. There's good reason also to believe that the control and the distribution of contraband is controlled by gangs in prisons. And we see some evidence of that in our data. And then lastly, there's symbiosis between street and prison gangs. They feed off of each other. In other words, what happens on the street influences what happens in prisons. There's orders that go in both directions. And we know that gangs influence dynamics in prisons, from where people sit, with whom they house, the programming that they're offered, who can cut their hair, and so on. We see that as well. And the last thing that we have good reason to suspect is that gang membership also increases risk for recidivism. That when someone's involved in a gang, and I'm going to show you our numbers, which are the most updated numbers that are available, that it increases the likelihood that they're going to be arrested, reconvicted, and go back to prison. Now, we know that there is a fair amount of evidence on this topic. We know that this is a significant issue for policy and practice. What you see in this chart, and let me take all these statements and contrast it with what you see in this chart. My colleague Megan Mitchell and I, we documented every single publication ever written about gangs, whether it was in the academic literature, whether it was in reports, and so on. And we documented it through the end of 2014. And there are about 5,000 studies related to gangs. That's a lot. What you see in the bars there represents the growth of our knowledge and the number of publications on this topic. What you see in that red line represents gangs in institutions. This includes juvenile facilities, this includes jails, and this includes prisons. If gangs are such a significant policy issue, why don't we know that much about them? Why is it that we're not conducting a lot of research on this group? Why is it that somebody could go into prison as someone who violated the law and coming out of there with affiliations with, say, the Aryan Brotherhood, with affiliations with, say, the Mexican Mafia? You would think that this would attract a lot more attention from people, whether it's race supremacy groups, their affiliations, whether it's related to issues of radicalization, whether it's related to issues of violence. You would think that this would attract more attention from the research community as well as the policy and practitioner communities, but it hasn't. So there is this work by Robert Fong. He was a researcher out of Sam Houston State University in Salvador Buentuelo. He worked for the TDCJ that tried to explain why this was the case, and this is, we're talking almost 30 years ago. And they said that official documentation was weak on gangs and gang members. Misconduct was just poorly documented. We didn't have good information on this. And remember, this is 1991. But people like Chad Trolson, who's over at North Texas, and Jim Marquardt, he was at UT Dallas, said that gang figures are some of the most elusive information to gather in prisons. Prison administration is generally reluctant to grant access to outside researchers. They're reluctant because prison authorities are generally risk averse. Why introduce the possibility of problems? They're worried about some information that might be uncovered by the researchers. They might be worried about the possibility of gangs reacting poorly to researchers. And it could be the case that researchers just are asking bad questions. They're not asking questions that are relevant to the prison administration. So that's another issue at hand. The last one is that gangs are prohibitive, or that gangs are secretive. They prohibit the sharing of information. In other words, when we go in and try to talk to them, they're not going to talk to us. Or they're going to tell us a story that they manipulate and try to sell us a bill of goods about what they're doing. And there's been some evidence of that. Some of my colleagues back at Sam Houston, they tried to go in and conduct this study in the prison system, and the members of the Mexican Mafia in the Aryan Circle forbade the participation in the research. So it's a risk, and that could partly explain why we don't know a lot about these groups. So enter the Lonestar Project. So if we wanted to learn about gangs, how would we do it? We could rely on the information that all of you gather, on intelligence reports, on incident reports. We could rely on other forms of official documentation. But the thing that we need to remember here is that some of that information is going to be driven by institutional priorities. It's going to be influenced by your own recording practices. We can also observe them. We can go into the prisons and observe them, and just observe their behavior. But that's risky, and it's hard to get access to do it. Access could be fleeting. Or we could survey them. We could actually go in and interview them and ask them questions. This has generated so much information about street gangs. We have learned a ton of knowledge about street gangs by simply talking to the gang members. Could this work in prisons? That's what we wanted to do in this study. So I'm going to shift gears here and give you some background about the Lonestar project. This was funded by the NIJ. It was a priority of theirs to study prison gangs, the relationship between prison gangs and street gangs. What are the consequences of prison gangs in prisons? It was also focused on re-entry. And then the emphasis today here is going to be more about the institutional side. I'm going to have a couple of slides about recidivism, but again, most of what I'm talking about and what the book talks about is about what they're doing on the inside. So I just want to put that caveat out there. We called it the Lonestar Project. We were in Texas. It was a study of trajectories because we're following these guys over time. There are associations. We didn't want to use the G word here. We didn't want to say gang in the title because that could really throw people off. And re-entry, the transition from the prison to the street. And why did we pick Texas? I'll give you the main reason, but let's first start with one of the explanations is it's the largest state prison system in the United States. Outside of the VOP, it has the largest number of facilities, 109 by the line last count. And these the red symbols represent TDCJ facilities, the green ones represent private facilities where TDCJ sends inmates. 150,000 prison inmates in the prison system. And then the stars represent prisons, diamonds represent state jails, the circles are geriatric facilities, medical facilities, and so on. It also has a violent and active gang population that stretches back to the early 1980s. So they recognize 12 STGs in the prison system, and I believe it's 67 cliques that are active in the prison system that are recognized. 7 of these STGs are automatically placed in ADSEG while they're incarcerated if they're confirmed members of those STGs. The Warriors in Texas represent a period of substantial change. That's when Texas went from essentially having 1 gang to 8 gangs in a matter of a 21-month period. We identified that about 3% of the gang members were murdered. 3%, you don't talk about mortality numbers in single digits. But 3% of the gang members were murdered in about a 21-month period between 1983 and 1984, and that led the Texas prison system to not just place the leaders of these gangs in ADSEG, but to place all members, all confirmed members of these gangs in ADSEG. And so the number of members of gangs, it increased by 8 or 9-fold in that 2-year period. What's important to remember here is not a single gang has formed that has had a lasting formation that we've documented in our study after 1990. Not a single gang has formed since 1990 in the Texas prison system. They're all from the 1980s and from 1990 when the Tongos were first grew. So Texas represents a great place to be able to study these issues. We were also in Huntsville. I was a faculty member at Sam Houston State University, and the prison was where we did most of our interviews, was just 10 minutes away at the Huntsville unit, the Walls. It represented a great opportunity. We also interviewed at the Estelle unit because that's where we did all our ADSEG interviews. But it's Prison City, USA. There are 7 prisons in Walker County. 5 of them were in the Huntsville city limits. And so we wanted to take advantage of our access to those facilities. Sam Houston has a great relationship with TDCJ. They're headquartered, TDCJ is headquartered in Huntsville. So it represented a good opportunity to be able to study these issues there. The Huntsville unit, also there's about 25,000 people who leave prison out of those doors that you see right here at about 10 o'clock in the morning every single day. We interviewed them about a day before they got released from prison. So if there's one slide that might involve some statistics, I just want to provide you a brief background here about why we did what we did, just to explain this to you. We were in the prisons for about 260 straight days doing interviews. We didn't do interviews when there were executions. We didn't do interviews on holidays. Again, those are just more solemn moments, and we tried to respect everybody who was in the prison. But we took a random sample of these guys, 802 of them that we interviewed. TDCJ identified 368 of these people as having an affiliation with the gang. They could be confirmed members, associated members, or they could have been identified as being former gang members too. But We interviewed 802 of them, and we randomly sampled them, and the reason why is because we wanted to say that our conclusions would also apply to the nearly 16,000 people who were released at the same time. So because of the random sampling, we were able to do that. Out of the people that we sat down and had a face-to-face conversation with, 94% of them agreed to participate in the study. The gang members weren't saying no, or at least they said no. The 6% of people overall who said no, they were just as likely to be gang members as non-gang members, at least according to TDCJ records. We focused on pre-release because we were worried they wouldn't participate. We thought that the ties to gangs could be waning at that time when they could be thinking about re-entry. Again, all these guys are thinking about re-entry. They're about to get out of prison. So that's why we focused on that point in time as opposed to getting them midway through their sentence. We were worried about non-participation, but those worries were clearly overstated. They answered our questions. It wasn't an issue, and I'll show you why that was the case in the next slide. We interviewed in April 18th, 2016 through December 11th, 2016. And then we did follow-up interviews when they got in the community. We wanted to see what changed. What are they worried about? Are they worried about their gang ties? Are they worried about, or is it their family that they're worried about? Is it getting a job, where to live? So that was 30 days out, and then we re-interviewed them about 10 months later. We asked them a lot of questions, almost 4,000 questions across those interviews. It was a lot of information that we asked them. Some of it sensitive information about gang activities, some of it about their families, some of it about their attitudes, and so on. Here's where our guys were from. This was before, this was their facility or where they came from before they went to prison for the bid before we did the interview. So as you can see, they're concentrated in urban areas. Over half of our guys are from these urban areas, and this is exactly what you would expect because there are more people represented in places like Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston. Go back one more. So a lot of you are probably wondering here, might have some skepticism in this room, and rightly so, about the validity of these guys' responses. Can you trust what they are saying? And we were concerned about this. At maximum, we were pessimistic that we wouldn't be able to get information. And we were really worried about it because the NIJ gave us a fair amount of money to be able to do this research, and we wanted to be able to deliver. So what we started by asking is, do the official records, the records that TDCJ have, do they tell the same story as what the inmates are telling us? That was question number one. Is there overlap between the 368 gang members who TDCJ is identifying and the 346 who told us that they were an active gang member while they were incarcerated? And it overlaps 83% of the time. That's higher than what we see with police records on the street when we interview gang members and we compare them to police records. So what this means is we're talking about the same people 83% of the time. That's pretty good. It's not perfect, but it is pretty good. Some people, about 10% of them, TDCJ was calling them a gang member, but then they said they had never had an affiliation with a gang in prison. About 8% of them said that they were a gang member and TDCJ just hadn't identified them. That's a problematic group. If TDCJ hasn't, they were involved in more misconduct, more victimization, and so on while they were behind bars. They escaped documentation while they were in prison. But we also found that gang members were just as likely to participate in the study, answer our questions. They weren't refusing to answer about the gang questions. They were more likely to answer about themselves. And they're slightly less likely to want to answer about the group. Partly because they didn't know about questions about when the gang formed, and other times they were being a little evasive. That happened on occasion, but that was definitely not the norm, it was the exception. So what's important here, again, is we're talking about the same group of people. The people that you would be interacting with or the prison system is interacting with and calling gang members are the same people that we're identifying as gang members in this study. So let's turn to the characteristics. What do these guys look like? Who are these individuals? And what do the groups look like? So I'll start by saying these are the guys who are represented in our study. These are self-reports. This is not according to TDCJ. But about 90% of the time, if TDCJ called them a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, that person in our study also called himself a member of the Aryan Brotherhood. And I should say, these are all men. We didn't have women in this study. There were 441 people who said that they were a gang member during their lifetime. About 80 of them, this is any gang membership, so this could be on the street or it could be in prison. About 80 of these guys didn't bring their gang affiliations into prison. They dropped out as teenagers, they dropped out before they got incarcerated. But we were trying to provide a profile here to be able to understand these groups. So the Tongos were the most represented, and they should be, because they're the largest gang in the prison system. We had multiple sets represented. We had a collection, a large group from Houston. We also had West Texas, Rio Grande, and then San Antonio. Those were the larger groups. We had a lot that would just identify non-denominational, or they would just say we're Tongo Blast, and they didn't associate specifically with a city. But they should be the most represented because this is a random sample. If we just took a random sample of gang members, the biggest gang should be represented. After that, we had different Crips, a variety of Crip and Blood sets. On the Crip side, the largest groups were 52 Hoover, Rolling 60s, Gangster Crips. And then on the Blood side, we had a large number of Bounty Hunter Bloods and Treetop Bloods. And then came the STGs, the ones, so Bloods and Crips are both considered STGs by the prison system. But then we had a fair number of members of the Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, Texas Syndicate, Barrio Azteca, La Raza Unida, and then HPL, and so on. So we have a fair number of these guys represented in this study. Again, this is the largest study, surveys of gang members that have been conducted in the prison system. And so we're going to break out our results based on their different groups and what they're saying about these groups. On your right-hand side, this is all gangs they had ever been in. There were 47 people who had been in a second gang. Sometimes they transition from a street gang, they get to prison, and they transition into a prison gang. That was pretty common. Or they left a family, they left the Mexican Mafia to go into the Tongos, which was not uncommon either. Okay, so here are some numbers. I'm going to go through these briefly, but what the thing to point out here is that on this side, this represents differences between gang members and non-gang members. And on this side is where we could say, well, generally we feel confident that they're similar to one another. So oftentimes we have to rely solely on prison records to look at these differences between the groups. That's all we have. We don't get survey data. We don't get other questions that aren't necessarily relevant to prison authorities. So we ask a whole bunch of questions that might not be relevant to them. So demographically, the gang members were younger, about 7 years younger. They were more likely to be Latino, less likely to be white, and proportionately black. One of the interesting findings was when we look at joining gangs in prison, I think we only identified a couple, like 1 or 2 black guys who actually joined gangs in prison. They all brought their gang affiliations from the outside, whereas the joining in prison was done mostly by white guys and Latinos. So that was an interesting racial difference that we observed here. They have lower levels of self-control, which is important because it's a strong correlate of misconduct and poor behavior and recidivism. Similarities, similar IQ scores, about as likely to be veterans, fathers in relationships, and so on. So we see some demographic differences, but we also see some similarities between the two. In their neighborhood characteristics, they describe their neighborhoods as just being poor places to live. They come from worse neighborhoods, which is what you would expect. They're more likely to have gang activity in their neighborhoods. They describe their neighborhoods as being more problematic, not having good regulation, parents who are watching their children, supervising their kids, and so on. Health differences, we see that gang members are saying that they experience more stress and more exposure to violence behind bars, yet they view themselves as having better health. So a lot of what we observe on street gangs is that they develop this bravado and their self-image to be able to make themselves look tougher and seem more infallible than those who aren't in gangs. Now, things get more interesting when we look at the attitudes and beliefs and then their social relationships. So we look at things like embeddedness in gangs. Not just whether or not they're embedded, whether or not they're a gang member, but how strong are they in these groups? How immersed are they? Non-gang members could be involved in gangs, but they might not have necessarily a strong connection to it. So the gang members clearly had a stronger immersion in these groups. They had stronger family support systems, which is a good thing. That should help recidivism. They had more criminal peers, exactly what we would expect to find. But then when we look at these criminogenic attitudes, what are their worldviews, their attitudes, their beliefs? And these are things that help write scripts for how they solve problems. In other words, when someone disrespects them, you could wash it off and walk away from it. Or when someone disrespects you, you could respond violently or check them. And we see that the gang members are adhering to these codes and these norms at a much greater level than the non-gang members. So the code of the street, adherence to the convict code, how they view law enforcement. So the gang members viewed law enforcement as far more illegitimate. They viewed law enforcement as being unfair to them, which is something that you would expect to find. And then they had a stronger, they were less likely to want to associate with other races, but not as much as we thought it was going to be. In terms of their criminal histories, there wasn't that as big of a difference as what we would expect to find. But again, these guys are 7 years younger on average than the non-gang members. Give them another 7 years and they would probably be catching up in terms of their arrest counts and their incarceration spells and so on. All right. The other thing I want to point out here is there's not one single factor that differentiates the gang and the non-gang. It's risk factors. It's multiple things. So it's not like you could pinpoint one thing and say, that person's a gang member. You have to be able to look at the broader picture of these individuals. That there are a whole host of risk factors that put them at risk for involvement in gangs. So gang members are about 10% of the released inmates out of Texas prisons, at least those who are active in gangs. So if the prison system's releasing 60,000 inmates every single year, we're talking about 6,000 gang members returning to the street every single year. What we see here for risk factors is that if they have very few risk factors, they're highly unlikely to get involved in these groups. If they have just 2 to 8 of them, it's only 2% of them who are getting involved in gangs. If they have 20 risk factors, you can almost guarantee that they're involved. So it's a broader picture and a profile that we're trying to establish of these guys that complicates some of this reality about them just a bit. So what you see on this slide, there's been this presumption, and I don't think people in this room would necessarily adhere to this view, but the larger population in the United States, the popular perception is that you have prison gangs and that you have street gangs, that they are distinguishable from one another. The walls that keep everybody out or keep everybody inside of the prison also confine the groups that are inside there. And so it has led to this perception that you have strong differences between the street gangs and the prison gangs. And this is about composition in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, age, and so on. This could be about their form, in other words, how they're organized, how they're structured. And this could also be about their function. In other words, their criminal activities, how they go about behaving. So this is one of those typologies that was developed. And the question to us is, does this have a basis of reality? Do the gang members themselves view this as being a dichotomy, that they're stuck in one place or another place? So we ask them, does your gang operate on the street? Does it operate in prison? Or does it operate in both settings? And we break these groups, we break the gangs into 4 categories. We think that this is a logical way to organize them. So we have the STGs. The STGs are defined as STGs because they have a history of violence, they've got a propensity towards violence, they have the ability to disrupt the social order of prisons, and they have an organizational structure that's different from street gangs and more of the cliques in the prison system. So that's one way we differentiate them. And then the other is whether they have a locus of influence. Is there influence on the street or is there influence in prisons? And so we ask them, where does your group operate? And as you can see here, the STGs, nearly across the board, there's a little bit on those who are not placed in segregation, will say almost universally that we're both a street gang and a prison gang. We're active in both settings. I know that's not news to most of the people in this room, but it is interesting to hear these guys themselves describe themselves that way, that they're not just a prison gang, their activities also occur outside of the prison system. On the prison-oriented side, we see these groups describing themselves mostly as prison gangs. And I'm sure there is some dispute about this, especially on the side of the Tongos, because we know that the Tongos are at least active on the street. But the guys who were members of the Tongos, over half of them said that they described themselves as mostly a prison group. The last one is the street-oriented groups. These are guys who get arrested with a gang affiliation on the street, migrate that into prison with them, but they say that their influences are mostly on the outside. They don't have a lot of sway on the inside, at least on the dynamics in the prison system. So the main takeaway here is that we shouldn't be thinking about them as, like, the words prison gangs and street gangs should not be described as separate from one another. They're in many ways one and the same. So we try to describe it as a context of influence. Where is their influence? Is it on the street or is it in prison? All right, so let's focus on their group level characteristics. And this is the first time something like this has been done that does not have to rely solely on law enforcement criminal justice reports. We asked them to describe their gangs. And what we were interested in is what these groups look like in terms of their organizational structure. How are they organized? And to share with us what we focus on their instrumental characteristics. In other words, when we speak of instrumental characteristics, how do we're measuring the pursuit of common goals. So when we look at organizations, whether it's the United States Marine Corps, whether it's universities, whether it's nonprofit groups, what makes them successful? And so we're looking at things like holding meetings. Do they have leadership? Do they have structure? Do they have rules set in place, constitutions, laws, and so on that they're supposed to follow? We also look at their expressive characteristics, their symbols, their signs. And then where they draw the line in the sand. What constitutes disrespect for them? What are they willing to tolerate in terms of disrespect from other groups? And their profit generation. Again, if gangs are supposed to be at the center of the informal economy, how do they make their money? Do they make it through the sale of drugs, sale of contraband, prostitution, taxing legal businesses, and so on? And then lastly, we look at communication. This was especially important on the inside when you think of groups that are placed in solitary confinement. How do they communicate with one another? So we're looking at a broad range of characteristics of their communication. Is it through text messages? Is it through written letters? Is it through phone-based conversations and so on? So we asked them a series of questions about this for every single one of the individuals who said they had ever been involved in the gang. And here's where we start to differentiate these groups. What we're focused on here is their instrumental characteristics. How different are they? Is there merit behind how we differentiate these groups based on their organizational structure? Is it truly the case that these STGs are the most organized in the prison system? And how are the Tongos similar or different from them? And what we see here, and these don't look like huge differences right here, but let me just state that statistically they are pretty large from one another. They correct for the fact that some of these guys don't know a lot about the gangs. If they've been a former gang member for 20 years, they might not know a lot about the group anymore. So it corrects for those types of things. What we can see here is that the STGs are clearly different. The ones who are placed in administrative segregation, they're clearly different from the rest of the groups. And this is across the board for all our comparisons. The Aryan Circle was the lowest in terms of their organization, their instrumental characteristics. The Texas Syndicate ended up being the highest. But even then, the Aryan Circle still scored higher than almost all of the remaining groups. The groups with the lowest organizational structure, they were the prison-oriented groups. These are the cliques, the Tongos. They didn't have it, for the most part. They had shot callers. They were more functional leadership. It wasn't structured leadership. So they were the ones who were influencers in specific pods, as opposed to having influence over the entire group in the prison system. Their expressive characteristics were largely similar to one another for the bottom three groups. The STGs, they were different. They had stronger adherence to their signs and their symbols, to their willingness to target law enforcement, what they said, their willingness to go after people who disrespected them. They said that if you cross the line, we are willing to fight for it. Whereas the other groups, they had less of a strong adherence towards that. So the street-oriented groups were similar to the prison-oriented groups, and the STGs that were not in segregation were similar to those groups as well. In terms of profit generation, there was the most variation across the board, across the 38 gangs, or the 39 gangs that are represented here. But the STGs that were in segregation stood apart from them, and this was the strongest difference out of all of our observations. They're far more entrepreneurial in how they went about generating their income, engaging in a wide range of sources, and the members would state this pretty universally. Whereas if you look at those who were not in segregation, those who were prison-oriented groups and the street-oriented groups, they were all a little more similar, but the prison-oriented groups, they weren't about, when they generated money, it was for themselves, it was not for the group. That was the key distinguishing factor. If I sell drugs, I take that money, that's my money. I'm not giving a cut of these profits back to the gang. So that was one of the ways in which that we distinguished them. And then communication, the SDGs, again, they stuck out from the rest of them, and there was a little less variation here. So we could see there's variation in these gangs. They're not all one and the same. The prison-oriented groups are not the same as the street groups, and the tangos are not the same as the SDGs. So we're seeing some strong differences across them. Again, if you start with this idea that there's prison gangs and that all prison gangs are just alike, it's simply not the case. All right, so the last section that I'll talk about before we go over to the Q&A here is the power and control. Again, if gangs are at the central part of the social order of prisons, how do they do it? What is it that they do to influence other inmates? So power comes in a number of forms. We could think about, and when we're talking about power, it's the ability to get people to do things that you want them to do. So you can talk about power, we think about it generally in leadership, but in political scientists tend to focus on soft power. That's like persuasion, convincing someone to do things without having to threaten them to do it. Hard power, so if soft power is the carrot, hard power is the stick. This is coercion. This is the threats of violence. This is intimidation. And then soft power is sort of in combination of the two. That's a lot about how international relations work. It's soft power is trying to convince individuals to do things with the recognition that you do have the stick behind you. And when we think about power, it's how else can you get 30,000 inmates to engage in a hunger strike? That's power. So how do they do it? First we think is violence. This represents the rivalry network of gangs in our study. And we think of gangs as being distinguishable from one another, not just because it's written into our statutes that there's a common theme that they engage in criminal behavior over sustained periods of time. Now, the willingness to use violence is part of what makes gangs powerful. It's not necessarily having to use violence. You could use it sparingly, but it's knowing that someone is willing to use violence in you is part of what we think about the ways in which gangs have power behind bars and how they're able to project it to the street. So we asked the gang members in the study, the 441 gang members, who their biggest rival was. So only asking them to define one group as their biggest rival. Some of them said law enforcement, some of them said correctional officers, and so on. But for the most part, they identified other gangs. So the arrows represent a rivalry between a group. There's a connection. There's an edge that's connecting these two gangs. And you can see, for example, the Aryan Brotherhood had 6 in degrees, 6 arrows pointing at them. They had 10 arrows going out to the Crips, Bloods, Mexican Mafia, Mandingo Warriors, Aryan Circle, Texas Mafia, and then pretty much any other racial group, including whites, other white gangs. The Mexican Mafia had 8 in degrees, 8 arrows pointing towards them, and 6 arrows pointing out, particularly to the Tangos, Barrio Azteca, HPL, Texas Syndicate, and the Aryan Brotherhood. The light arrows represent fewer responses. In other words, if we have 34 members of the Aryan Brotherhood in our study, if the arrow's really light colored, there's not as many people identifying it as the biggest rival. If the arrow's darker, it means that a lot of guys are identifying this as a rivalry. So you can see a stronger endorsement of the rivalry between the Aryan Brotherhood and the Aryan Circle and the Mexican Mafia. And then the Mexican Mafia had one between the Texas Syndicate and where the Texas Syndicate was the strongest, and then the Crips and Bloods, obviously, and then Tacos and Texas Syndicate. So we find overwhelming evidence in our study that the gang members are involved in more misconduct and violence behind bars. This is when you take into account all these rival explanations too. that they're involved in more misconduct, and it's generally gang-related misconduct that's pushing up this risk of violence and victimization for them. And we think that it has to do with these rivalries. So a lot of violence for gangs is intra-gang. In other words, they hurt their own members, but then there's also inter-gang. They're hurting members of rival gangs, and some of it is going to non-gang members. So these last two slides here is about how inmates view gangs. So the gang members, what they have to say about power, control, the sale of contraband, who runs the prisons. And this complicates the picture a little bit. What we find, there's a couple of findings here, and one of them is that there appears to be two sets of rules that are going on in these prisons. One that relates to the gangs, and one that relates to everybody who's not in gangs. That's what we're seeing. And so these rules have to do with things, there's some things that are universal related to hygiene, related to race that everybody adheres to. But then there's some that are just specific to the gangs that they need to follow. And the gang and non-gang inmates, though, they viewed themselves very differently. The gang members sort of had an outsized view of their influence on the prison, where the non-gang inmates, they just didn't view the gangs as being as influential as what the gang members thought. And what we see here is that there's only one instance of where they all agree. And so we asked them, what happens when gangs have problems? And they all agree that the prison suffers. Everybody suffers because there's lockdowns. The whole place gets shut down when the gangs fight. But everywhere else, it's very different from one another. Some of these differences are large. Some of these differences are small, and some of them are in between. But both of the groups seem to agree that the role of gangs in the social order of prisons is oversold. They didn't believe that prisons, or they thought that prisons were more violent because of gangs, not less violent. And there's some arguments out there, more from political scientists and economists, that gangs bring order to the prisons and make them safer. But the inmates don't agree with that. The gangs don't fix the problems. They would rather have correctional officers fix their problems than having the gangs fix the problems. The gangs don't make people feel safer in prison. And it's fine. You can get by just fine in prison. You don't have to affiliate with a gang. Even though there's a popular perception that you do have to. And so this was seen as pretty universal across these guys. The other interesting finding to us was that a near majority of these guys said that you didn't need the permission of these groups to sell contraband in prisons, whether it's cell phones or whether it's drugs, alcohol, and so on. So this complicates the picture a little bit in terms of gangs in the social order of prisons. They clearly have a role, but we don't necessarily think that they're at the core of making all decisions and at the top of this inmate hierarchy. Now, we also asked some open-ended questions, because this is the last slide, and then we'll go over to the Q&A. Some open-ended questions and said, what do you guys think about this? So we've structured our questions to say, you've got to answer it this way. Then we open it up to say what they really thought about it. And these are pretty representative quotes, I think. We didn't cherry pick that's consistent with our narrative. But what's important to point out here is that this first one, the rules and social order, it recognizes that there's two sets of rules in there. They recognize the gang rules, and then they recognize the rules of all prisoners, the inmate code more generally, that people should adhere by. The other one is with contraband, and this somewhat contradicts what we say about gangs and contraband. These guys are saying, no, the gangs run the contraband in the prisons. They're the ones who are responsible for getting it in, as you can see with this quote right here, talking about getting basketballs thrown inside of the yard that are loaded up with cell phones and drugs, that they control the access points, partly because they have access to people on the outside who could support activities on the inside. And they recognize that if you're not in a gang, you're not selling drugs while you're incarcerated. The other finding is related to the exercising of power in prison. And these quotes, we think, the symbiosis, the black column, is pretty representative. The ways in which gangs have power is the way they project it to the street and the way the street projects it to prison. So these street gang members, they know that eventually they're going to get arrested. It's going to happen. They commit enough crimes and eventually they're going to get detected by law. It might not be the first one, but by the 10th one, they're probably going to get caught and they're going to end up in TDCJ custody. And they recognize that when they do get caught, everything that they do is going to come back to haunt them when they get to prison, if they are not following the orders of what's coming out of the prison. But they also recognize the reverse is true. So the inside controls the outside. but the outside also has influences on the inside too. That being said, there is almost a universal opinion, this is the last point I want to make here, that the prison gangs have changed. And these are not just Tongos saying this. These are also members of the families. This is members of the Aryan Brotherhood, Aryan Circle. They're all describing prison as being far more watered down. Some of them tied this to PREA. They said after the Prison Rape Elimination Act, it meant that you couldn't get away with having fights. Everybody you got told on. Correctional officers would no longer look the other way when there was violence occurring. Others pointed to solitary confinement as having a huge impact on disrupting the order of prisons. But they generally viewed that the organizational structure wasn't as strong in these groups, and they weren't as violent as they used to be. And these are some pretty representative quotes here that you see on the right-hand side. From, I think, both of the top two are STGs. The bottom one is a prison-oriented member who'd been around for a long period of time. They don't describe these gangs as being as disciplined as they used to be. They don't describe these gangs as being as violent as they used to be.